In the prior module, we looked at the $state provider service. The $state provider service has a state method for defining a state. Each state includes a name and an object literal. The properties of the object provide the state details. We looked at the basic set of object properties: URL for the fragment identifier associated with the state, template URL for a link to the HTML file containing the view template for the state, and an optional controller. Another very useful property is resolve. Resolve is a property of the state configuration object that you can attach to a route. It can provide custom content or data to the defined controller. It identifies a set of dependencies that can be used or injected into the controller. If a dependency is a promise, the promise is resolved before the controller is instantiated and the route is changed. This means that if the code is retrieving data, it waits for the data to return before navigating to the associated route and displaying the view. This simplifies the controller because the controller does not need to fetch the data. These dependencies are defined with key-value pairs, where the key is the name of the dependency. The value can be a string, which defines the name of a service that can be injected, or the value can be a function. We want to use resolve to retrieve the data for the product detail view. Remember the product resource service that we built earlier in this course? We'll use that again to retrieve the data for the detail view. The product resource service calls a web service on a remote web server and retrieves the product data. Previously, we used the query method of the product resource in the product list controller because we wanted an array of products returned for display in the list. The product resource service also provides a get method for returning a single product. We'll use that to retrieve the one product for the product detail view. Why not use the product that's already in memory from the list? Well, we want to ensure that we have the most recent data in case it was updated by another user. Currently, we don't have a web server. We are currently intercepting the calls to the web service with another service which mocks the data. This allows us to run the application without the web service in place. Here is code that uses the resolve property to retrieve the data for the product detail view. Resolve is a property of the state configuration object. Resolve is defined with an object literal comprised of key-value pairs. The first key-value pair defines a dependency on the product resource service. As we just saw, the product resource service is the service that provides the data for the application. We built this earlier in the course. We are going to use that service to load the data for the detail page. The key is named product resource. This key could have had any name, PR, A, whatever. I named it as the same name as the service for clarity. The value is the string name for the service. The resolve assumes that any string name provided as a value is an alias for the service. The second key-value pair defines a dependency on the result of the defined function. The key is named product because this function returns a product, but it could be named anything. The value is a function that returns a promise. This function depends on the product resource service identified in the first key-value pair, hence the reason we needed to define that dependency first. This function also depends on the $state param service. The $state param service is part of the UI router. It is a service that is populated by the current state's parameters. This service is needed because our product detail state has a product ID parameter, and we want to obtain that parameter in order to retrieve the appropriate product. The first line of this function uses $state params to read the product ID parameter. The second line of this function retrieves the defined resource using the get method of the product resource service, passing in an object with the ID of the product to retrieve. The function then returns the associated promise. You can add any number of key value pairs here if you need to obtain multiple sets of data for the state. When this product detail state is matched, this code first pulls the product ID from the parameters passed to this state. It then calls the get method of the product resource service, which returns a promise, and issues a get request for that product. The product resource mock service intercepts that request, looks up the product with a defined ID in its in-memory list of products, and returns the product data. When the data is returned from the service, the state is activated, the controller is constructed, and the product dependency is injected into the controller. The defined template view is then displayed, and the data in that view is populated from the model defined in the controller. Let's add this code to the sample application and give it a try. Here we are back in WebStorm. The app.js file is open. We will add the resolve property to the product detail state. So we need a comma here and the resolve. So as discussed in the slides, the resolve is defining two dependencies. One on the product resource service, defined with the key product resource, and the second on a function that gets the defined product. The key for that dependency is product. Next, we need to modify the product detail controller to take in that injected product. So we're going to go back to the product detail controller, and then we can inject in product. So we can replace this hard-coded product with the product that was injected in. Now, since we're now passing a parameter into the function, we need to modify the registration to define the product in a min-safe array. So we're going to make this second parameter an array and define product in a string as the first element of that array. Now look at how clean and simple our controller is. Now let's run the application and see if we get the right data. So we go to the product list, leaf rake, yep, that's the leaf rake. Garden cart, yep, that's still there. So the resolve is getting the appropriate data for the product detail view. It works. Let's review what's happening here. When we click on a link, the state is changed. Behind the scenes, the state is matched in the list of states. The controller is constructed with the retrieve product passed in. The HTML file defined with the template URL is downloaded if it was not already, and it's displayed. Since the HTML file contains binding expressions, those expressions are evaluated and the data is populated. Notice that the address bar is changed to /product/10, where 10 is the ID of the product to view. Use the resolve property when defining a state to retrieve the data for that state. That ensures that the associated view is not displayed until the data is retrieved and ready. We have just seen how to use the state configuration resolve property to preload data and provide that data to the controller. Check. Now let's change gears and look at nested routing states.